The airport was bustling, like any typical Tuesday afternoon. Maira Norris stood in line at the check-in counter, feeling the weight of exhaustion pressing down on her. She had been traveling for what felt like forever, delayed flights, missed connections, and the strange quiet that always seemed to settle in airports. She had never been a fan of the chaos, but today, it felt especially heavy. As she stared at the counter, the sterile, fluorescent lighting above seemed to hum in the background, offering no comfort at all. The line shuffled forward slowly, and Maira could feel her patience slipping away with each passing minute. Her eyes darted around the terminal, trying to distract herself from the frustration building up inside. A loudspeaker crackled overhead, announcing another delay for the flight to Dallas, and the faces of the passengers around her twisted with annoyance. It wasn't helping. She had just spent the past 5 hours on a layover, and now she was stuck in another interminable queue, waiting to be processed for another flight. Her phone buzzed in her pocket, pulling her from her spiraling thoughts. It was a message from her father, Chuck Norris. "I'll be there soon. Keep calm. I'll handle it." Maira's lips curled into a small, tired smile as she read the text. She appreciated the thought, but something in her gut told her that this situation was already way beyond her father's usual calm demeanor. She wasn't sure why, but she couldn't shake the feeling that something was about to happen. Something she couldn't control. Before she could send a response, her attention snapped back to the line as it moved forward. Maira stepped closer to the counter, her nerves starting to tighten. The woman behind the counter gave her a quick smile, but it was barely noticeable, a forced expression of politeness. Maira had seen that look before. It was the look of someone who had done the same thing too many times, someone who was ready for the shift to end, someone tired of the constant churn of passengers. "Name?" the woman asked, barely looking up. "Maira Norris," she replied, trying to keep her voice steady despite the discomfort creeping up her spine. The clerk typed her name into the computer, her fingers moving swiftly, then paused. Maira noticed the slight hesitation, something felt off. The woman's brow furrowed for just a moment, but she quickly masked it with another practiced smile. "Ms. Norris, I'm afraid there's a slight issue with your ticket," the woman said, her tone now more serious. Maira's heart skipped a beat. "What do you mean? My ticket should be fine. I just need to get to Dallas." The woman glanced over her shoulder, her eyes darting to a man standing nearby in a black suit. His face was unreadable, a blank mask of professionalism. Something about the way he stood there, too calm, too controlled, set Maira on edge. But before she could say anything else, the clerk spoke again, her voice low and almost conspiratorial. "I'm going to have to ask you to step aside for a moment, Ms. Norris. There's an issue we need to clear up." Maira's pulse quickened. "What do you mean? I've done nothing wrong." "Just a routine check," the woman replied, a touch too quickly. "Please follow him." The man in the black suit stepped forward, gesturing for Maira to follow. Her instincts screamed at her to refuse, to stand her ground, but her feet moved before she could stop them. Every part of her wanted to argue, to demand an explanation. But something told her to remain calm, at least for now. They walked down a narrow hallway toward a more private area of the airport. Maira's mind raced with possibilities, none of them good. Was there a mistake with her flight? Had someone falsely flagged her as a security threat? Or was this something even worse? As they reached a small office tucked away from the main terminal, the man stopped at the door and gestured for her to enter. The room was dimly lit, with only a single fluorescent light buzzing overhead. A desk sat in the middle, piled with paperwork. A woman in a dark blue uniform sat behind it, her eyes scanning a laptop screen. She looked up as Maira stepped inside. "You're Maira Norris?" the woman asked, her tone cool, but with a faint edge of something else, something more unsettling. "Yes," Maira replied, trying to keep her voice steady. "What's going on? Why am I being brought in here?" "Sit down, Please, the woman said, nodding to the chair across from her. Maira hesitated, glancing at the man in the suit, who stood silently by the door. Slowly, she sat down, the air in the room suddenly thick with tension. We have reason to believe there's been a mistake with your travel arrangements, Ms. Norris, the woman said, her voice almost too calm. We need to verify some things before you can proceed. Myra's heart was pounding now, and she could feel a knot forming in her stomach. What mistake? I don't understand. The woman didn't respond immediately. Instead, she looked down at her laptop, typing something quickly. Maira could feel the minutes dragging by, every second stretching into something unbearable. Finally, the woman looked back up, her gaze sharp. Ms. Norris, I'm afraid we're going to have to ask you to leave the airport. What? Myra's voice was barely above a whisper. She stood quickly, shaking her head in disbelief. No, this is a mistake. I'm just trying to get home. You can't kick me out. We don't have a choice, Ms. Norris, the woman said, standing up from her chair. You've caused a disruption, and we're not going to let you board your flight. Myra's breath hitched, panic setting in. What disruption? I've done nothing wrong. This doesn't make any sense. I'm afraid you're going to have to leave, the woman repeated, her tone icy. Now. Tears of frustration welled up in Myra's eyes, but she quickly blinked them away. What was happening? Why was she being treated like this? As she was escorted out of the room, the world outside seemed to blur. The chaos of the terminal, the ringing of phones, the footsteps echoing through the hallways, all of it felt distant, as if she were trapped in a nightmare she couldn't wake up from. But then, just as she reached the main area of the terminal, something changed. It was subtle at first, a shift in the air, like a collective pause among the passengers. People stopped talking, their attention drawn to something, or someone, who had just entered. Maira turned her head, and her eyes widened in disbelief. There, standing at the entrance to the gate, was a familiar face, a face she had never expected to see here, of all places. Chuck Norris. The world seemed to freeze for a moment. Myra's breath caught in her throat. Her father, her legendary father, had just appeared, like a force of nature, cutting through the tension in the room with his very presence. He looked calm, unshaken, but there was a fierce intensity in his eyes that made it clear he wasn't here by accident. The staff member who had been so eager to kick Maira out faltered, her mouth opening and closing in confusion. She had no words for what was happening. But Chuck Norris didn't need to say a word. With a slow, deliberate stride, he approached Maira, his gaze never leaving her. She could see the concern in his eyes, the protective instinct that had always been there. He reached her side and placed a hand gently on her shoulder. Is there a problem here? His voice was steady, commanding. The staff member stammered, looking between Chuck and Maira, clearly at a loss. I wasn't aware. I didn't know who she was. Clearly, Chuck replied, his tone low but sharp. Now, what exactly is the issue? Maira stood there, frozen, as the situation unfolded around her. The tension in the air dissolved almost instantly, and the staff member seemed to shrink before Chuck's gaze. The airport, which had been so hostile just moments ago, now seemed to hold its breath. Chuck Norris didn't back down. He was a man who had seen the worst of situations and remained unfazed. And now, standing beside Maira, he was ready to handle whatever came next. But something in Maira's gut told her that the real mystery was just beginning. And whatever had happened here today was only a small piece of a much larger puzzle. Maira stood there, the bustling airport terminal around her now felt distant and blurred. The harsh fluorescent lights seemed too bright, the air too heavy. Her father's hand on her shoulder was the only thing grounding her in the moment, but even that was not enough to shake the gnawing unease that had settled deep in her gut. Chuck Norris, the man who had stepped in and effortlessly defused a situation moments ago, now stood quietly beside her. His calm presence was a stark contrast to the chaotic, tense atmosphere that seemed to have enveloped the airport since her arrival. But even with the familiar comfort of his presence, Maira couldn't help but feel that something was terribly wrong. Something much bigger than a mere misunderstanding at the check-in counter. The staff member who had ordered her removal was now nowhere to be seen, and the whole situation felt off. The airport had gone silent, as if the entire terminal was waiting for something, a confirmation, a resolution, or perhaps, an explanation. Maira turned to Chuck. His expression, usually so composed, was more serious than she had ever seen. There was a quiet fire in his eyes, one that told her this wasn't just about an airport mix-up. He had come here for a reason. "Dad," Maira whispered, trying to get his attention. Her voice was shaky. "What's going on? Why are we being dragged into this?" Chuck didn't answer immediately. Instead, he gave a subtle nod to the two men who had been silently observing the situation. The men in dark suits had been waiting at the side, their expressions unreadable. They both stepped forward now, one of them holding a small tablet in his hand. The man looked directly at Maira, his gaze cool and calculating. "I'm sorry for the inconvenience, Ms. Norris," the man said, his voice formal and impersonal. "I know you're probably confused right now, but I need you to listen carefully." Maira felt the tension rise in her chest again. She looked back at her father, trying to read his face, but he remained as still as a rock. It was almost as if he were waiting for something to unfold, something he had known was coming. The man in the suit continued, "We need to speak to you in private, Ms. Norris. It's important." Maira's thoughts were racing. What was going on here? And why was Chuck Norris involved in all of this? She had never imagined that a simple flight could escalate into something so intense. Yet, here she was, caught up in something far beyond her understanding. "Private?" Maira echoed, her voice rising slightly. "Why? What's this all about?" Chuck stepped in before the man could respond. "Maira, you need to come with us," he said, his voice low but filled with an unmistakable authority. "There's something you don't know. Something I should have told you earlier, but now it's too late. We need to move quickly." Maira's heart was racing, but she nodded, trusting her father even though she didn't understand what was happening. She followed the men through the terminal, the sound of their footsteps echoing in the otherwise quiet space. As they moved past the security checkpoints and toward a more secluded area of the airport, Maira couldn't shake the growing sense of dread. They reached a small, unmarked door near the back of the terminal. It led to a narrow hallway that felt as if it had been designed to keep people out, like a place where secrets were hidden. Chuck paused in front of the door and turned to Maira. "Stay close," he warned in a low voice. "And don't speak unless you're asked." Maira nodded, swallowing hard. There was something in her father's voice that told her this was no ordinary situation. She didn't know if it was the sharp edge in his tone or the way the men around them stood watch, but it felt like the walls were closing in. The door opened, and they stepped into a small, dimly lit room. The only furniture was a long table at the center, surrounded by chairs. A couple of security cameras hung from the ceiling, their blinking lights serving as a stark reminder of the privacy they had just lost. Maira didn't like the feeling of being watched, but the unsettling presence of the two men following her father made it feel worse. Chuck motioned for Maira to sit down at the table, his eyes never leaving the men who had led them there. "I need you to hear me out," he said, his voice now steady and firm. Maira took a seat, her hands trembling slightly. Her heart was pounding. She didn't know what was coming, but she could feel that this moment would change everything. Chuck sat across from her, the two men taking positions near the door. No one spoke for a moment, and the silence was deafening. Then, the man with the tablet, the one who had spoken earlier, finally broke the silence. He set the device on the table and turned it toward Maira. On the screen was a photograph, but it was not just any photograph. It was of a plane, a commercial airliner, flying through a storm. But what caught Maira's attention was the small, barely noticeable object in the bottom corner of the frame. "What is this?" Maira asked, her voice quiet, almost scared to know the answer. The man nodded gravely. "This is a photo of your father's jet, Ms. Norris. But what you see here is not a coincidence. The plane in that photo was not in the right place at the right time. It's been tracked, and there's something we need to understand." Chuck looked up sharply at the man. "You're not telling her everything," he said, his voice growing tense. "She needs to know why this is relevant to her." Maira's head was spinning. "Why are you showing me this? What does this have to do with me?" The man sighed, his face hardening. "Because the flight path of your father's jet leads us to something much larger than a simple aviation issue. Something troubling." "Troubling?" Maira repeated, trying to keep her voice from shaking. "What are you talking about?" The man paused before answering, his words measured and careful. "Ms. Norris, your father's flight is connected to an international incident, a covert operation that involves national security. You've been pulled into something far more dangerous than you realize." Maira blinked, unable to process the words. This wasn't possible. Her father was an icon, a figure whose legendary reputation spanned decades. But what they were saying didn't make sense. How could something this serious involve her? Chuck finally spoke, his voice low but heavy with the weight of the truth. "Maira, there's a reason I've kept you in the dark for so long. But it's time you knew. This isn't just about my past, or the things people know me for. It's about something I've been working on for years, something classified." Maira felt a lump form in her throat. She could hardly believe what she was hearing. "What do you mean? Why didn't you tell me about any of this?" Chuck's eyes softened, but his words were still heavy. "Because it was never supposed to involve you. But now it has. And we need to figure out what's going on, fast." The man with the tablet nodded in agreement. "Ms. Norris, the situation is more urgent than you understand. Your father's involvement has triggered a chain of events. We need to know what you saw during your flight, who you spoke with, and if anyone else is involved." "I don't know what you're talking about," Maira said, the fear in her voice impossible to hide. "I've been on one flight, and I haven't seen anything strange." The man stared at her, his expression unreadable. "The strange part is that you're sitting here now, alive. There are people who are not happy that you've been brought into this." Maira's stomach churned. She felt trapped, like a puppet caught in a string of events beyond her control. The revelation about her father's past was only the beginning. There was something more going on, something sinister that she couldn't yet understand. "Just tell me what's happening," Maira pleaded, her voice breaking. Chuck took a deep breath and stood up, walking around the table to stand beside her. "We're going to get through this, Maira. But first, you need to trust me. Everything you thought you knew, it's about to change. The truth is more dangerous than you can imagine." The two men at the door exchanged a glance. The room seemed to grow colder. And in that moment, Maira realized that whatever was happening wasn't just about her father anymore. It was about her, too. And the truth was something that no one was prepared for. Maira sat still, her body tense, every part of her mind racing to make sense of the words that had been spoken. Her father's past, something that had always been wrapped in mystery and legend, was suddenly far more complex than she could have ever imagined. The room felt smaller now, the air colder, and the weight of the unknown pressing in on her chest. The two men in suits stood by the door, watching them silently, their presence like a constant reminder that things had escalated beyond a simple misunderstanding at the airport. She could see the concern in her father's eyes, the unspoken burden he carried, but there was also something else, something she hadn't noticed before. His quiet demeanor now held an edge, a wariness. That made her feel as though there was something much larger at play, something bigger than herself. "Tell me everything," Maira finally whispered, her voice trembling. She needed the truth, no matter how dangerous it might be. Chuck Norris looked at her, his gaze intense but filled with a sadness that Maira hadn't seen before. He took a deep breath, his hand running over his jaw as if he were contemplating just how much to reveal. "Maira," he began, his voice low, "there are things I've done, things that were necessary at the time. But now, it's all come to light, and you're caught up in it. I should have told you sooner, but I thought I could protect you from it. I thought I could keep you safe." Maira's heart pounded in her chest as she tried to process his words. "What do you mean? What things are you talking about?" Chuck walked to the window, his back turned to her as if he needed a moment to gather himself. "It's not something I'm proud of, but I was involved in operations that no one could ever know about, operations that were supposed to stay secret, forever." "Operations?" Maira repeated, her voice barely a whisper. "You mean like, what? Espionage? Government stuff?" Chuck nodded slowly, his posture tense. "Yes. The kinds of things that no one would understand. Things that were so classified, so dangerous, that even people in the highest offices had to keep their distance. But it's more than that now. The things I did, they have a connection to you, Maira. A connection I didn't know existed until now." Her mind was racing, every possible explanation flashing through her thoughts, but nothing seemed to make sense. "A connection to me? What do you mean?" Just then, one of the men by the door spoke up. "Ms. Norris," he said, his voice professional but with a hint of urgency, "I think it's time we showed you something." Maira turned her gaze back to the man. He was holding a tablet, but this time, the screen displayed a map with several locations marked in red. There were coordinates, dates, and cryptic notes scattered across the screen, like a puzzle she had no way of solving. "This," the man continued, "is a map of every known location your father has been to during the last 25 years. We've tracked every move, every operation, every mission. These coordinates are not just points on a map. They are connected to something far bigger than we anticipated." Maira's breath caught in her throat. "You've been watching him all this time? Why?" Chuck spoke before she could process the full weight of the man's words. "It's not just about me, Maira. The operations I was involved in, they were part of a much larger network. A network that spans across nations, corporations, and governments. And the reason you're being pulled into this, is because you're the key." Maira stared at her father in disbelief. "The key? To what?" "To stopping it," Chuck said, his voice steady but filled with a seriousness that sent a shiver down her spine. "What I've done in the past has led to something, a situation that's dangerous, even deadly. And you're the only one who can help us stop it." Maira felt like the world around her was spinning. Her father, the man she thought she knew so well, was involved in something far darker than she could have ever imagined. And now, somehow, she was part of it too. "But I don't understand," Maira said, her voice trembling. "What do you mean, I'm the key? How am I supposed to help? I'm just a normal person." Chuck's face softened as he looked at her. "You're not just anyone, Maira. You've always had a unique ability, a sense of intuition, a knack for finding answers where others see only confusion. You've got the skills, the mindset. And now, you've been brought into this for a reason." The man with the tablet interjected, "Ms. Norris, your father's involvement in these operations was pivotal. But what he didn't know, what none of us knew, was that the operations would lead to something we couldn't control. A series of events set into motion by a group of powerful individuals who are playing a game of their own. And they're not stopping until they get what they want." Maira's mind was racing. "What do they want? What's so important that you need me involved?" Chuck walked toward her, his eyes filled with a deep, sorrowful understanding. "They're after something I hid, something that was never supposed to be found. It's been lost for years, but now it's surfaced again. And they'll stop at nothing to get it. A chill ran through Maira as she realized that her life, once filled with normal worries about work and relationships, had just been torn open, exposing a world of shadows she couldn't even begin to understand. And what is it? Maira asked, almost afraid to hear the answer. Chuck hesitated, then said, a document. A list of names and plans, people who have been involved in the darkest dealings across the globe. And they want to use that information for their own gain. They think it will give them power over governments, corporations, and individuals. They think it will make them untouchable. The room fell silent as Maira processed the gravity of what her father had just revealed. A document, hidden for years, containing secrets that could change the course of history. And now, somehow, she was involved in this dangerous game. But why her? Why now? One of the men standing by the door spoke again, his voice even more serious than before. Ms. Norris, this isn't just a matter of stopping criminals. This is a matter of global security. There are forces at play here that threaten the balance of power in the world. Your father has spent years trying to prevent this from happening, but he's only just realized how far-reaching it is. Maira's head was spinning. What am I supposed to do? How am I supposed to help you stop this? Chuck looked at her with a deep, almost sad gaze. You've always had a way of seeing through the noise, Maira. You can read people, see connections that others miss. You're going to need to use those skills more than ever. But you're also going to need to trust us, and yourself. Maira swallowed hard. The weight of his words settled over her like a heavy blanket. Her world had turned upside down in the span of a few hours. What had started as a normal, frustrating day at the airport had quickly evolved into something she couldn't have prepared for. The man with the tablet cleared his throat and stood, walking to the other side of the room. Ms. Norris, there's a lot more we need to explain. But we need to move quickly. Time is not on our side. Chuck nodded gravely. There are people who want that document more than anything. And if they get their hands on it, they won't hesitate to do whatever it takes to keep their secrets safe. Maira stood up, her legs shaky, but her resolve strengthening. I don't know what's going on. But I'll help. I have to. I can't just sit back and let this happen. Chuck smiled, a small but genuine smile, and for a moment, she saw the father she had always known, the protector, the man who would fight for what was right. You've got it in you, Maira, he said softly. We'll get through this together. But even as he said the words, Maira couldn't shake the feeling that the storm was just beginning. They were entering a world of danger, deception, and secrets, one that could destroy everything they had ever known. The game had changed. And Maira was now a player. The room felt suffocating as Maira tried to process the chaos she had been thrown into. Her father's words echoed in her mind, a document that could change the course of history. It sounded too surreal to be real, like something out of a spy thriller. Yet here she was, in the middle of an international crisis, with no clear idea of what would come next. Chuck Norris, the man who had always seemed invincible, the embodiment of strength and control, was now telling her that everything they'd ever known was on the verge of unraveling. Maira had always admired her father for his resilience, his strength, but now she saw a different side of him, a man burdened with secrets and dangers far beyond her comprehension. Come on, Maira. Let's go, Chuck said, breaking the silence. He turned and walked toward the door, his expression hardening. The two men in suits followed closely behind, each carrying an air of urgency that made Maira's stomach churn. She felt like a pawn being pushed further into a game she had never chosen to play. Where are we going? She asked, her voice shaky as she stood up and followed him. She wanted to scream, to demand answers, but she held it in. She needed to stay calm, at least for now. We don't have time to explain everything, Chuck replied, his voice grim. But we need to get you out of here, now. The tension was thick as they moved through the corridors of the airport, the echoes of their footsteps seeming unnaturally loud. Maira had never felt so out of place, so small. The world around her had turned into a blur, her focus narrowing to only one thing: survival. What was happening? What was at stake? And why was she involved in all of this? The world she had known, the world of simple routines, quiet evenings, and occasional family gatherings, had just crumbled, replaced by a nightmare that she could hardly grasp. She was no longer a simple bystander. She was part of something much darker. And there was no turning back. They reached a private entrance to the airport, where a black SUV was parked, the engine running. Chuck opened the door and gestured for Maira to get in. "We're leaving, Maira. It's too dangerous to stay here." Maira hesitated, a wave of uncertainty crashing over her. She didn't know if she could trust the people who were leading her into this unknown world. But her father, Chuck Norris, was with her. She had to trust him. He was the one person in her life who had always protected her. He had to have a plan. He had to know what was going on. She climbed into the car, the door slamming shut behind her with a finality that felt ominous. The driver, a silent figure in a suit, started the car and pulled away from the airport, merging onto the road without a word. Maira stared out the window, the landscape rushing past her in a blur of motion, but her mind remained frozen. "Dad, what is happening? Why didn't you tell me about any of this before?" she asked, her voice barely above a whisper. She needed answers, needed to understand what had drawn her into this web of danger. Chuck didn't answer right away. Instead, he glanced at her with a tired expression, as if the weight of what was happening had finally started to take its toll. "Maira, I've been protecting you from this for a long time. I wanted to keep you safe, to keep you normal. But that wasn't possible. Not anymore." Maira frowned, confused. "What do you mean, not anymore?" Chuck sighed deeply. "The people we're dealing with, Maira, they're dangerous. I've spent years trying to stop them. But I didn't know the full extent of their reach until it was too late. And now, it's all coming to a head. There's no avoiding it anymore." Maira's heart raced. "But you still haven't told me what this is all about. What's in that document? What does it mean for me?" Chuck paused, his gaze hardening. "The document isn't just a list of names, Maira. It's a record, a detailed history of covert operations, high-level corruption, and dangerous alliances. It involves powerful people from all over the world. If they get their hands on it, they'll control everything. Governments, corporations, the media. You name it." Maira's mind spun as she tried to process his words. It sounded like a conspiracy, something that belonged in a fictional thriller. But it was real. Her father's life had been built on these secrets, these operations that nobody could ever know about. And now, she was involved, whether she liked it or not. "And how does this document connect to me?" Maira asked, her voice trembling despite herself. "Why is this my problem?" Chuck turned to look at her, his expression softening. "You don't realize it yet, Maira. But you have something they want. Something they'll stop at nothing to get." Maira's breath caught in her throat. "What do I have? What could I possibly have that's so important?" Chuck's eyes darkened. "The answer's not something I can explain in a few words, Maira. But trust me, it's everything." The car took a sharp turn, and they entered a secluded area on the outskirts of the city. The streets grew quieter, the buildings more sparse, until they finally stopped in front of a large, nondescript building. It looked like a warehouse, hidden in plain sight. There were no signs, no obvious markings to indicate what it was. But Maira knew this was where the next chapter of the story would unfold. The driver opened the door for them, and Chuck stepped out first, followed by Maira. She hesitated for a moment, taking in her surroundings. The place felt isolated, as if it were built to keep people out. "This way," Chuck said, guiding her toward the building. Inside, the space was dimly lit, and Maira could see several men in suits, their faces impassive as they worked at desks covered with papers and screens. It was clear that this wasn't just any building, it was a command center, the nerve center of some kind of operation. Maira felt the weight of the situation settle deeper into her bones. They walked down a narrow hallway, and Chuck led her into a small, secure room at the back. A single computer sat on the desk, the screen displaying more maps, documents, and cryptic codes. It was all foreign to Maira. She had no idea how any of this worked. "Sit down," Chuck said, pointing to a chair across from the computer. Maira obeyed, still overwhelmed by the gravity of everything. Chuck sat next to her, his gaze fixed on the screen. He typed quickly, entering a passcode that unlocked yet another layer of security. "Maira, I need you to listen carefully," Chuck said, his voice steady. "The people we're dealing with, they're not just criminals. They're organized. They have power, resources, and connections that go far beyond what you can imagine. And they'll do whatever it takes to find that document." Maira's stomach twisted with fear. "And what happens if they get it?" Chuck's face hardened. "Everything changes. The document contains the names of every key player involved in illegal operations, both domestic and international. It's a blueprint for control, and if it falls into the wrong hands, it will give them the power to dictate everything, who stays in power, who doesn't. It's the kind of power no one should ever have." The reality of the situation began to sink in. Maira wasn't just a bystander anymore. She wasn't just an innocent person caught in the crossfire. She was part of the game. She was involved in stopping something that could change the world as they knew it. "Where do we go from here?" Maira asked, her voice barely above a whisper. Chuck turned to face her, his expression filled with a mix of concern and determination. "We find the document, Maira. We destroy it. That's the only way to stop them." Maira looked at the computer screen in front of her, her mind racing with thoughts of what was at stake. The risks were high. The danger was real. And the people they were up against were powerful, ruthless, and willing to do anything to get what they wanted. But Maira wasn't about to back down. She had a new understanding now, one that transcended fear. She had to help. She had to see this through, no matter the cost. The truth had been laid bare in front of her, and there was no turning back. As they began to dig deeper into the mystery, Maira felt a surge of determination. The game had begun, and the stakes were higher than ever. The weight of the situation settled on Maira's shoulders like a heavy cloak. It wasn't just her father's words that haunted her, it was the realization that everything she had known up until now had been a lie. She wasn't just Chuck Norris's daughter. She wasn't just a bystander. She was an active part of something much larger, a battle against forces that could destroy everything. The document, the secrets, the people involved, it was all too much to process in such a short amount of time. She sat in the dimly lit room, the soft hum of the computers the only sound. It was almost eerie, the silence after everything that had happened. Her mind raced, trying to make sense of it all, but there was a growing knot of fear in her stomach that she couldn't ignore. Chuck was still focused on the screen, typing quickly, his brow furrowed with intensity. He'd been working on the same series of documents for what felt like hours, piecing together information that was well beyond Maira's understanding. She could tell he was searching for something that might offer them a way out. "Maira," he said suddenly, breaking the silence. "Come here, I need you to look at this." She stood and walked over to him, her legs stiff from sitting so long. She glanced at the screen, trying to make sense of the complicated web of codes, maps, and documents that covered it. But nothing made sense. It looked like a tangled mess of foreign languages and strange symbols. "What is all of this?" she asked, her voice filled with confusion. Chuck sighed and rubbed his eyes. "This, Maira, is the reason we're in danger. This document I've been telling you about. It's not just a list of names. It's a record of everything that's been hidden from the public. High-level conspiracies, covert operations, black market deals, illegal surveillance. It's all here. Maira's heart raced. She didn't want to know more, but she knew she had no choice. She had to understand what she was up against if she was going to survive this. But why is it so important, she asked, trying to keep her voice steady. What do they want with it? Chuck's face hardened. Because it's a blueprint for global control. This document ties together a massive network of corruption, influence, and power. If it gets into the wrong hands, the people who have it can manipulate entire governments, industries, media outlets, everything. It's the kind of leverage that gives them complete control over the world. Maira recoiled. You mean, these people could take over everything? The whole world? Chuck nodded grimly. That's exactly what they want. Maira sank into the chair beside him, her mind struggling to grasp the full extent of the threat. She had always known her father had connections, but she had never imagined something like this. She had always seen him as an untouchable figure, someone who could handle anything that came his way. But now, she saw him for what he truly was, a man caught in a web of danger that he couldn't escape alone. And somehow, she was now tangled in it too. The screen flickered for a moment, drawing her attention back to it. Chuck typed something into the keyboard, and a new document popped up, a file labeled Final List. Maira could feel the tension in the air as her father studied the file. This is it, he murmured. The final piece of the puzzle. Maira leaned in, her eyes scanning the list of names, dates, and locations. The names were familiar, many of them high-ranking politicians, corporate CEOs, and influential media figures. The kind of people who were untouchable, who played the game of power from the shadows. But then, something else caught her eye, a name she didn't recognize. I don't understand, Maira said, pointing at the name. Who is this? Chuck's eyes flickered to the name she was pointing at, and his expression shifted from one of determination to something darker. That's someone I never thought I'd see on this list, he muttered. Maira's curiosity piqued. Who is it? What's so important about this name? Chuck hesitated, his fingers hovering over the keyboard. It's someone from my past, he said quietly. Someone I thought I had left behind. Maira's mind raced. Her father's past had always been a mystery to her, a subject he rarely spoke about. But she had always known there was more to his story than what he let on. Now, she was about to find out just how deep the rabbit hole went. Who is it, Dad? Maira pressed. Why is this person so dangerous? Chuck took a deep breath and turned to face her. It's a man named Victor Drago. He's a former ally, someone I trusted once. But he betrayed me, and I thought he was dead. Now I see that he's been pulling the strings behind the scenes for years. Maira's stomach twisted. So, this man, Victor Drago, is behind all of this? Chuck nodded grimly. He's the one who orchestrated the entire operation. He's been working with the people on this list, building an underground network of power. And now he's looking for the document. If he gets it, he'll have the leverage to take control of everything. There's no stopping him. The room felt colder now, the weight of Chuck's words sinking into Maira's chest like a heavy stone. She had never heard her father speak so seriously about anyone before. He had been a protector, a legend in his own right, but now he was afraid. Maira could see the fear in his eyes, the fear of failure, the fear of what would happen if they couldn't stop Victor Drago. It was a look she had never seen before. It made her realize just how much was at stake. Do you have a plan? Maira asked, her voice steady despite the rush of adrenaline coursing through her veins. Chuck met her gaze. I'm not sure yet, he admitted. But we need to move quickly. The longer we wait, the closer we get to the point of no return. Maira nodded, her mind whirling. This was no longer just a mission to stop a document from falling into the wrong hands. This was a battle for survival, a fight against a man who had the power to reshape the world as they knew it. "We need to find him," Maira said, her voice filled with resolve. "We need to stop Victor Drago before it's too late." Chuck's expression softened for a moment. "I never wanted to drag you into this, Maira. But now, it's our only choice." She didn't hesitate. "I'm with you, Dad. We'll stop him. Together." Chuck gave her a tight nod, and they both turned back to the screen. There was no more time for hesitation. The battle was far from over, and the truth was more dangerous than they could have ever imagined. As they continued to analyze the document and gather information, the weight of the task ahead loomed large. But one thing was clear: they were running out of time, and Victor Drago was getting closer to his goal. And as the hours ticked by, Maira couldn't shake the feeling that they were being watched. Someone was out there, waiting for the right moment to strike. It was only a matter of time before the hunt began. Maira's pulse quickened as she sat in the dimly lit room, the blue glow from the monitors casting sharp shadows on her face. Everything she had believed in had been shattered. This wasn't some random conspiracy. This was a fight for control, a battle between power-hungry individuals who would stop at nothing to win. Her father, Chuck Norris, the legendary figure she had always looked up to, was no longer the man she had grown up with. He was a soldier, an unwilling participant in a game much darker and more dangerous than she could have imagined. Victor Drago's name lingered in her mind. An echo of the past that threatened to consume them both. The fact that Drago had been alive this whole time, and working behind the scenes, was something Maira hadn't expected. For years, her father had made it seem like his past was a series of closed chapters, tucked away and forgotten. But now, those chapters had come alive in the worst way possible. "Maira," Chuck's voice cut through her thoughts. "We're going to have to move fast. Drago's agents are closing in. We don't have much time." She turned toward her father, who was standing near a cluttered desk, his face drawn with concern. His usual confidence was clouded now, replaced with a sense of urgency. The man who had always seemed invincible was now facing a threat so formidable that even he didn't know if they could win. "We can't just sit here," Chuck continued. "We need to find Drago before he finds us. And more importantly, we need to find the other piece of the document. The one that we don't have yet." Maira felt a cold chill creep down her spine. "The one we don't have, where is it?" Chuck didn't answer immediately. Instead, he glanced at the map on the wall, which was covered in red pins and strings connecting various locations. There were places marked in bold, places where Drago had been known to operate, places where Maira's father had once tracked him down. But that was years ago. Now, it was as if Drago had come out of the shadows with a vengeance. "I don't know," Chuck admitted. "But we need to start looking. We don't have the luxury of waiting around." The weight of his words hung heavy in the air. Maira's mind was spinning. They were hunting a ghost, someone who had been orchestrating events for years, and they were doing it in the dark. Every step they took would be a risk, and every move could lead them closer to Drago's web of power. "We'll find him," Maira said, trying to push down the fear creeping into her chest. "We'll track him down. But we need to know everything we can about him, his next move, his plan." Chuck nodded, and for a moment, it almost seemed like he was considering something. Then, his eyes met hers with a new sense of resolve. "I know someone who might be able to help. A contact. Someone who's been on the inside of Drago's operations." Maira's heart skipped a beat. "You have a contact inside Drago's network?" Chuck paused, as if weighing whether or not to tell her more. "Yes. But it's risky. This person, let's just say they've been playing a dangerous game for a long time. But if anyone can help us locate Drago's base of operations, it's them." Maira frowned, feeling uneasy. She wasn't sure she was ready to trust someone who had been involved with Drago for so long. But the urgency in her father's voice told her that there was no other choice. "When do we meet them?" Maira asked. Chuck pulled out a small device from his jacket pocket and handed it to her. "In 2 hours. They'll contact us with the location." Maira took the device, feeling its cold weight in her hand. It was strange, holding this small piece of technology that could mean the difference between life and death. She felt the pressure of what was at stake, and it made her breath catch in her throat. For a moment, everything seemed to freeze. The world outside their small, safe space had become a chaotic storm. They were no longer just running from danger, they were preparing to strike back. They were entering a fight that could change everything, not just for them, but for the entire world. "We'll do this together," Chuck said, his voice low but steady. "We've been through worse. And we'll get through this, too." Maira looked at her father, the man who had always been her protector. She knew this wasn't just about stopping Drago anymore. It was about survival, her survival, and Chuck's. The stakes had risen, and the path ahead was more uncertain than ever. "All right," Maira said, her voice firm. "Let's find Drago. Let's end this." The meeting. 2 hours passed like a blur, the anticipation hanging thick in the air. Chuck and Maira stood near the door of their temporary hideout, watching the clock tick down. The sound of the ticking seconds seemed too loud in the stillness, each moment stretching on forever. Finally, the device Chuck had given Maira buzzed to life. It was a message. Maira glanced at it. It was a set of coordinates, with a time and a warning: "Come alone. No one can know about this." The message was brief but clear. Maira's heart raced as Chuck read over her shoulder. He didn't say anything at first, but his grip tightened on the back of the chair. "We need to move fast," Chuck said, his voice steady but urgent. They left their safe house quickly, slipping through back alleys and keeping out of sight as much as possible. They couldn't risk being seen, Drago's agents were everywhere. The shadows were closing in, and they were no longer in control of the narrative. They were reacting to the events that were unfolding. Trying to stay one step ahead of the chaos. The coordinates led them to an abandoned building on the outskirts of town. It was a place that looked like it hadn't been touched in years: broken windows, cracked concrete, and overgrown vines creeping up the walls. There was an air of decay surrounding it, as if this place had once held something important and now was only a shell of its former self. "This is it," Chuck said quietly, his voice low. "Stay close. We don't know who we're dealing with here." They approached the building cautiously, checking for any signs of life. Every sound seemed amplified: the creak of the floorboards, the rustle of leaves in the wind. It was as if the world had grown silent, holding its breath in anticipation. Maira's heart pounded as they reached the door. Chuck motioned for her to stay behind him as he slowly pushed it open. Inside, the air was thick with dust, and the smell of decay hung in the air. "Who are we meeting here, Dad?" Maira whispered, her voice trembling with a mixture of fear and curiosity. Chuck's face was unreadable. "Someone who knows things. Someone who has the answers we need." The door creaked open fully, revealing a dark hallway ahead. They stepped inside, the sound of their footsteps muffled by the thick layers of dust. There was no sign of anyone yet. But Maira knew they weren't alone. Not for long.